Welcome to another program of No Compromise here on Revelation TV. I sometimes sit here thinking, now what will we talk about today? But then I see that amazing display of names, and it's an inspiration. So I have another name here in the studio with me, Dr. David Landrum, who is the Director of Advocacy at the Evangelical Alliance. Nearly said Universal Alliance. And David, you've been there for quite a few years now, so you're a veteran.
Been there 10 years, working for the Alliance. I nearly said it seems like longer, but long time.
And you've actually, we're living through societal change, and you happen to be someone who's actually written theses and about this years ago. That's the things that happen in politics and education, and it makes me feel completely ignorant. So I might steer you back to the Bible when we talk too much about politics. But I first met you in the office of Labour MP, Jim Dobbins, who's a lovely chap who was quite fearless, defending the unborn and other things like that. Just tell me, give us a sweep of the David Landrum career, and then we'll get into some details.
Well, I hope I don't have a career.
Good.
But I know what you mean.
Yes.
I mean, I was saved at the age of 26 in a little Baptist church in the middle of these council estates in Liverpool. And the Lord took me from there. I was a builder, like my father,
Wow.
and he took me into education. I didn't have any qualifications, or I didn't attend school very regularly in Bootle, in North Liverpool, where I'm from. And the Lord took me in successive sort of sequence through A-levels, through a BA in politics, which I didn't think I had an interest in, but God assured me that I did. And then a PhD in political philosophy, particularly focusing on education policy. And from there, I was doing some research and some teaching. I moved to work for Bible Society in Parliament as the Parliamentary Officer. The Senior Parliamentary Officer, even though there wasn't a Junior Parliamentary Officer,
Very
one
good.
of those titles. And spent 10 years working in Parliament, advocating for the role and the place of the Bible in politics, in our political structures, in our political language, in our political culture, how it has shaped and is shaping, still continues to shape how we do politics. And that was when we first met. I was based at that time.
It was about 10 years ago.
Yeah, I used to run the all-party parliamentary group for Christians, so Jim was very much involved in that, and I was based in his office, which was wonderful.
Brilliant. Now, I can't exactly age you, but I'll try. I won't even ask you, but there have been some pretty major events that have happened in the UK. If you were based up in Liverpool, you may have known that you've been around when they had the Toxteth riots, real upheavals in our sort of urban communities. How were you there at the time? And
I was there. I remember I was working in the building trade. I was a young lad, and we drove down Upper Parliament Street the next day, and it was still on fire. The street was still on fire. I remember it very, very well, and a number of my friends, stroke accomplices, were involved in all of that. This was before I was a Christian, so yeah, I remember that unrest well, and I remember most notably the context of that unrest, which was just extraordinary deprivation and poverty, and the recession that the UK and other countries were in after the oil crisis. It was a profound. Half the people in Liverpool left the city to look for work. That's why there are Scousers all over the world now. Everywhere you go, you find them, because they had to leave and look for work. It's a very difficult time.
Yeah. And so now you sort of spooling forwards to 2020. You'd have thought during lockdown everyone would be staying indoors, but it just seems, especially in the States, cities are up in flames. It's just hard to believe it.
It's hard to believe it on one level, because the rationale for it doesn't really stack up and doesn't really make sense. But if you do what I do, which is look at ideas, my whole world is looking at ideas. Ideas are powerful. Ideas will come into your home they'll take your children. Ideas will take your liberty if you're not careful. So my heart is to look at where ideas come from, their source, their roots, what they do, the effect they have, and the trajectory, the direction of travel that they're likely to go in. And earlier this year, me and my wife, we were in New York. My wife's from New York. And we were just preparing to come home, and thank God we just got out as the lockdown happened in New York, and it was beginning to lock down, and central Manhattan, it's like a ghost town, you know, nobody on the streets in one of the busiest cities in the world. And I remember turning to my wife as we were going on a bus up Madison Avenue and saying, all these shops that you see, these swanky, you know, Rolex and everything, I said, these are all going to be vandalized. There's going to be civil unrest in this city. There's going to be a lot of disorder here and violence. And she was surprised by this. And I said, it's going to happen in June or July. It's going to be prompted by a Rodney King kind of injustice somewhere that will be blown up on the TV and then politicized and taken into a political program. And it'll be fueled by that. And I predicted that in March, and I called it right on time.
That's unbelievable.
But I'm not saying I'm prophetic.
No,
this is my job.
That's right. So there is a way of reading prophecies, but there's also the biblical way that if people go away from acknowledging, you know, not just selectively acknowledging, but acknowledging God's rule book, they go away. If societies, if politicians go away from that, we're in trouble.
Well, if people go away from it individually, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
If families go away from it, they're in trouble. If organizations, towns, cities, nations go away from it, societies go away from it. But what we've got in the West is a situation where the culture has departed from God. And it is a Romans 1 situation. If you want a succinct analysis of our cultural situation, Romans 1, you don't need to go any further than that.
But except that for me, the most telling line is, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over.
Yeah.
To
depraved mind. There's a sequence that Paul outlines as, in Romans 1. The first one is rebellion against God and rejection. We call that secularism. The Bible uses words like godlessness and things like that. Then there's idolatry, because we're worshipping creatures. We've got to worship something. So we put things in God's place, and we have a very idolatrous culture at this time. And then the third thing is minds become dull. You know, when you depart from God, you kind of lose your bearing intellectually. And this is what Nietzsche called when the earth is unchained from the sun, everything spins out intellectually. We've seen that with postmodernity in our universities and relativism. And that's playing out in politics now. And then you've got issues like sexuality and identity being a product of that, and confusions around that. People not understanding who they are in the sort of biological order of things. And Paul concludes with the increase of wickedness. And
that is something that's not static. So it seems as though you think, oh, it's terrible, you know, let's say 10 years ago, 20 years ago, what's happening? And it didn't stay there. It sort of seems to, the progression of godless logic seems to just have no end.
Well, it's culture, isn't it? When we talk about culture, we're talking about a socially embedded system of signs and text, of meaning. And every culture thinks that culture is static, but it's always fluid. It's always moving and evolving and co-opting. And it's Ecclesiastes, nothing is new under the sun. Culture builds sequentially on what went before and what interfaces with it. And our culture is no different. Our culture is, you know, we've heard a lot about climate change in politics over the last few years. But the former chief rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sacks, he describes our situation in the West as being one of cultural climate change. I really like that. It's a very good analogy. The whole weather analogy works very well with culture, by which he means that the moral ecology that we had, by which we lived, the Judeo-Christian values that informed why we care for the elderly, why we care for the young, why we have civility in public life, why we expect civility, we expect truth from our politicians, all that stuff. that's changing, and we're in a moment of kind of trauma and consternation that's been accelerated by the pandemic.
And you know, there's another word that seems to have just evaporated: trust. So because of things shifting and becoming amorphous, and you can't. I mean, we can trust the chairs we're sitting on just about, but it seems as though all of the sort of philosophical underpinnings have gone.
Trust is intimately connected to truth. And I think it was Jonathan Sacks who said, you know, when you have no truth, you can't have trust. And when you have no trust, you can't have communication. And when you can't have communication, you do not have society. What you're left with is kind of atomized individuals, fragments, who have no idea of a common good, because they disagree about the fundamentals around what it means to be human and what is truth itself.
So I was once with an intellectual who said to me, the problem with you evangelicals is you can't get over John 14 verse 6. That's your great problem, which is I am the way, the truth and the life. They say that's your problem. But actually, that's the solution.
That is the solution. That's a good problem to have. Yes. I mean, it's not entirely right. The West, our culture that we've come to enjoy all the fruits of, is built on what we call a correspondence theory of truth. Truth is what corresponds to reality. If I sit off this chair, I will fall on the floor. The truth corresponds to the reality of gravity. And that is biblical. And rationality is sown right through the Bible. The problem, as ever, is Jesus. He's the problem and the solution in every way. He says he doesn't have the truth and speak the truth. He does say that. But then he says, I am the truth, embodied, walking, talking, the point of all truth, the point of all history, the centerpiece of everything is this man who walked in a desert for 3 years and then was crucified, had no money, had no armies, had no real earthly power. But it seems to me the whole of history orientates around this truth, and he is the solution.
I don't know whose book this is. I should know it, so you're a very literary chap. Lord Liar or Lunatic, talking about the Lord Jesus.
I don't know that one. I know that C.S. Lewis did say...
Okay, so it's an explanation. You know, you can't just completely dismiss. You've got to say, is he?
Yeah. Well, I do recall C.S. Lewis saying Jesus is either mad, bad, or who he says he was, and the choice is everyone's to make.
Just while we're on this, it's really important. I speak to some atheists, and I'm talking about meaning and purpose, and they say, I'm happy to live my life without meaning.
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, well, at least that's being honest.
Yes.
Because atheism from Enlightenment times operated parasitically, I believe, on Christianity and on the structures of even the kingdom of God and truth claims and everything else. But as it comes to its logical or illogical conclusions, and Nietzsche is the greatest atheist philosopher, in my opinion, because he had the courage to face the reality of life without God, which is the Übermensch, which is domination of one over the other, which is evolutionary science in many ways, but it's also nihilism. Without God, you are ultimately confronted with not just your own mortality, but the meaninglessness of it all. It was Dawkins, was it not, who said, you know, the universe is characterized by blind, pitiless indifference. Well, speak for yourself, but I see the hand of God, and I am in awe of God's creation. And he says, where is his masterpiece? He calls human beings his poema, his poem. Wow, awesome. And that's the hope and the inspiration that many atheists are missing right now. And I read a very helpful little book on this at the beginning of this coronavirus pandemic by John Lennox, the professor of mathematics at Oxford. And he just moves systematically through the poverty of the thinking and conversations and responses to the situation we're in from atheism and secularism. there's just nothing there. So your atheist friends, I would say, are being honest. And I respect them for that in one sense.
Yeah, same here. And they're very deep, and only God knows where their heart is. And some of them had, I suppose, a tiff with Christians at school, and they're determined never to concede any territory.
Well, Christians do perform some anti-evangelism sometimes. That's got to be said. We don't help the gospel mission sometimes.
No. You mentioned John Lennox. Folks who watch World in Focus will have seen him, and you can get that on catch up. He's an amazing Trojan, as it were, in our day. He's also written. My son's reading a book, which a friend Gillian gave to us, called 2084. It's very, very good, opening up on artificial intelligence. Right. So he's sort of playing off 1984, but he called it 2084, and he's a real treasure, John Lennox. So we're talking up at this level, David, but many folks are down in the workplace as Christians, actually in the middle of this maelstrom of cultural change. How can we help and encourage them to be witnesses today?
Well, I done a sermon last week. I recorded it in my kitchen on the Wednesday for a church meeting on the Thursday.
I've been in your kitchen.
You have been in my kitchen.
It's a great privilege to be in your kitchen.
But it was very odd. I was standing preaching to my cooker, or preaching to an iPhone based on my cooker with a microphone. Very strange. And the sermon was, I think, is it Luke 12, where Jesus says, do not worry, do not worry. Don't worry about this world. I'm in control. And I transposed that onto the modern day fridge magnet slogan, keep calm and carry on. Yeah. I think the first thing to say to Christians in the midst of all of this is have peace. Because the difficulty is if we lose our peace and we're swept along by the world. I've just read, before I come here, Isaiah saying, do not call everything conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear. And I think there's a lot of fear about right now and uncertainty. And we need to ask God for peace. Jesus said, my peace I leave with you. It's a gift from him. And Paul describes it as the peace that passes understanding. It doesn't make sense. It will never make sense. It's a case of believe, receive, and then live out of that peace. And I do think that in these times of great shaking, and I can talk about Hebrews 12 all day long, our peace can be probably the most powerful witness to Jesus.
That's good, that's good. And when we look at those who have suffered through the generations, that's what marks them out. Right from the early Christians who were persecuted, they had some sort of heavenly demeanor.
It's not to say that, worrying and fretting and anxiety are sins, but Jesus does command us not to worry. That means he's given us what we need not to worry. And my view is that the longer you go, it's a discipleship issue, the longer you walk with the Lord, you should develop the practices of operating out of the peace. I've got a friend of mine who's a Nigerian pastor, and he just oozes peace. And his view is, if I lose my peace at any time, I stop whatever I'm doing until I regain my peace, and then I operate out of it. I think it's a wonderful way of approaching the world today.
And so while I've got you, David, let's go into some other deep issues. In Acts 17, Paul engages his audience, but it seems that the points where he in those days and we in today's world sort of clash with secularism is where we points to the resurrection. And it just seems that is like a dividing line, that some followed him, that was when people walked off. Mm-hmm. That for me is the key element of my faith, that, it's not what we're doing now is part of some wonderful journey into eternity. And so the resurrection is a key teaching of Scripture, which is supernatural.
Yeah.
But how do we get that across? Especially kids who are on student campuses, they are having to convey something which is so alien to our culture.
Yeah. I think it always will be alien, in the sense that, you know, the fall means that death is sown into the very being of living in this world. And to overcome death, to rise from the dead, it is quite a revolutionary act. But it's the foundation of our faith. I remember Tom Wright, the great theologian, being interviewed by a Guardian journalist who was, I think, trying to kind of undermine him, and come away impressed because Tom was quite open about the fact that everything he believes is based on the foundational belief that Jesus rose from the dead bodily, rose from the grave, and the faith builds on that one thing and will return. So, yeah, I mean, the only way you can really articulate any news about Jesus, any information about Jesus, is by being in close fellowship with Jesus. I can't introduce you to somebody that I don't know.
That's good. Yeah, that's good. That's good. And we were talking about meaning, and so when I'm in these, because things are coming to me while I sort of recall conversations, for me, the meaning scale, as it were, really stacks up when you put the resurrection into it, and that's why I felt that to steal my thunder, as it were, or absorb my punch, the atheist said, I don't need meaning. So all of that sort of argument is thrown.
It is thrown, and today, across a lot of the public policy work that we do at the Alliance, there is I would say, a concerted effort to annul what we would call the doctrine of sin. The idea that there is something fundamentally wrong in us, in human nature, and that plays out in various actions and intentions and motives. Because you think about it, if you remove sin from the conversation, you have no need for a cross. And I do see that being a contemporary battlefield.
I often reflect on Isaiah 5, the song of the vineyard, which among one of the woes is woe to those who call evil good and good evil. But in that, it also says woe to those who just sort of steering us back to a sort of socialist, woe to those who just add house upon house until there's no space left. And yet, that wisdom is there embedded in the prophecy of Isaiah, and it seems as though our modern world, is, I suppose, avoiding the deeper issues of life by just materialism. Build a house, get a mortgage, get a pension, you're sorted.
And it comes down to your conception of human nature. I think all great philosophical debates really come down to this. Are we intrinsically good or intrinsically bad? And, the Lord says we're a combination of both, but we are fallen creatures and we need a saviour. And we see this playing out across a whole range of different areas in society.
So, right, I'm not supposed to completely date the programmes, but we're in the middle of the pandemic, which it's difficult, therefore, to date the programme. But what is going to happen in 2021? I mean, we seem as though the Chancellor has spent all the money in dealing with the first wave, and now we're in a second wave, so to speak, and it just seems as though the economy is okay. It has a lot of momentum because we're 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, but there's only so much money that can be spent, and then the enormous inertia is going to eventually hit a brick wall because there's no more money. And if you look historically about when this printing of money has taken place, it's dangerous.
But quantitative easing is one thing. The problems we had with the last credit crunch, as we called it, was liquidity. We don't have an issue with liquidity anymore. We have an issue with the global collapse of all markets. This has never happened. The world economy has never been globally interconnected and interdependent in the way it is at this moment in time. It is my view, and I'm not an economist, and I could be wrong, but it is my view that we are heading into at least a decade of extraordinary economic difficulty, probably way beyond our imagination. Because it just looks a mathematical certainty. We're already in it. We've just been insulated by the furlough scheme and lockdown and being at home and everything else. But we're beginning to see now the mass unemployment developing. It'll certainly develop into the early next year, and the summer of 2021 we'll see, no doubt, I predict extraordinary civil unrest across the Western world, particularly, the US, obviously. I shouldn't say that, but it's true. Yeah. But particularly France and Belgium are going to have difficult times. And it's not going to be restricted to any one place, because people will be feeling the economic strain of things then.
And they've got people, as Bob Dylan said, when you've got nothing to lose.
That's the danger. That's it. Yeah. When people have got nothing to lose, that's a very dangerous situation.
And then if the weather is nice and clement and warm, then people go out for a day out, and it can escalate.
Yeah. Well, and we're going to see sort of waves of lawlessness. There's no doubt about it. And I said early on in this pandemic, we'll move through the different phases. I feel sorry for all governments around the world trying to deal with this. Nobody was really prepared for it. They'll get some things right, they'll get some things wrong.
The mix of the media will exaggerate every error.
Yeah, every error. And politicise it as well.
Commend the things that are right, because it's, how can you? You don't know the end result. It's as though it's sort of hardwired in to the mass media that's they're going to make it worse.
Well, I mean, what would you do in the, politics? I've worked in politics now for 20-something years. Politics is often, politicians are people who serve and lead, and God blesses them because of that, whether they're Christians or not. I really believe this. Some of them are very anti-Christian, but I believe God blesses them because they stand in the gap and they take decisions that nobody else is prepared to take. Many of the big decisions in politics have already been taken. So the politician's job is really to make the best out of
whatever.
It's the lesser of two evils, as it were. And I would like to see more Christians being realistic and accepting that. And because regardless of which decisions are made, I'd rather have someone praying at that point. And Christians will still get stuff wrong and get stuff right, and that's fine. But we need Christians in politics. We do.
There's another sort of law that seems to happen, the law of unintended consequences. So, who would have thought that we would be close to a no-deal Brexit? If you have watched all of the build-up to, let's say, the referendum and post-referendum, it seemed very unlikely. It seemed that all of the establishment, everyone was sort of geared to keep it steady as you go. And now we're facing that in addition to everything else.
Yeah, but we've got to put things into perspective. And that's another thing that peace gives you, a sense of perspective. For me, I was watching the Brexit debates and the sort of hysteria all around it with great interest. Don't get me wrong, it's a very important referendum about an important issue. But there are bigger issues that have come through our parliament. David Cameron's government redefined marriage. Can we just stop and think about that just for a minute there? We can go into the European Union, we can come out of the European Union can change, we can do all sorts of different trade deals. That's all important. But to redefine the social institution, the foundation for everything in our society.
Irrespective of your religion. It's been there for thousands of years.
For me, it's without doubt the biggest policy decision or change in my lifetime.
Yeah. No, it's weird. And then you have to say, well, we have to trust the Lord, because things have that was not foreseen, was it? It just came out of the blue.
No, it was not foreseen. It was not democratic. It was not in the manifestos. It happened in the only way it could possibly happen. And the consultation was pathetic.
And so much so, on this law of unintended, you may be answering it in what you've just said, because when it came to the referendum, there were a number of politicians and Labour politicians in the North saying, well, people are voting against us because of the marriage, the gay marriage, when the media had let the thing die down.
I think it was
people were still felt that they had been cheated.
Well, Dominic Lawson, who run the think tank, was it Compass that he used to run? I can't remember. It was one of the left-leaning think tanks. He done an analysis shortly after when people were going into meltdown because of the Brexit vote. And his analysis concluded that the decisive factor was in the Conservative constituencies, the Cameron thought he had in the bag, they were lost primarily because of this issue, marriage.
And trust, loss of trust.
Well, it was the issue. It was the redefinition of marriage, according to Dominic Lawson, who's not a Christian. No. And that analysis and research was soon buried very quickly. But I mean, it's the nature of politics. People don't forget.
No,
they don't.
Right. Okay. So we are now in a situation. I don't think we've opened up enough. What? Let's put it onto the positive, because we've had a few minutes of talking about how dire everything is. The opportunities for the gospel during this terrible, downturn which we can foresee.
The opportunities are profound at this moment in time. People have lost. There's a great shaking. I've been preaching for 10 years from Hebrews 12. God is shaking everything so that what cannot be shaken may remain. And what we've seen with the pandemic is quite simply an acceleration of shaking. And the things that people thought that they could rely on, foundational things in their lives, are all falling apart. And particularly this idea that people had an idea that they had a sense of control. That has completely shattered. Yeah. It's a great time to talk about the Lord. I was buying fruit and veg with my wife at a farm shop a few months back now, in the beginning of all the lockdown and everything, and never met the owner before, didn't know we were Christians, and he just turns around as we're buying our potatoes and says, I'm not religious, but somebody told me this is all in the Bible. And, from that point, it took about 25 minutes to pay for the potatoes. We were talking about Jesus and eschatology and our culture.
Amazing.
It's an amazing opportunity. And we've seen him since, and you can build bridges, you can make connections with people. People have questions. Yeah. They really do.
It's really good. And also, going a bit back onto the negative, but when they see Christians being thrown out of their workplace because all they've done is testified or worn a cross or something like that, it does get, eventually that builds up and accumulates in, let's say, Middle England, in the mindset where people think, what is going on? Because we all grew up, I did anyway, I'm old enough, with singing All Things Bright and Beautiful in school, and many people still have that sort of subliminal awareness of our past.
What people have is, they have an expectation that society, democracy, freedom, justice, law and order, security, wealth, that these things will continue as they have known them. But we're at the point where the bank is empty. Christianity is no longer the center of our society. We are a minority at the margins. And by the way, that's where we operate best, I believe. But people still expect that things are going to carry on. But they're not. Everything's going to be different without Christianity. And for the worse, is my view. Everything is going to be for the worse. Because, as James says, all good things come down from the Father of heavenly lights, in whom there is no shadow or turning. Everything good comes from the Lord. We've lived on that, we've abused that, we've abandoned that, and now it's changing. But there is a backlash against it. I was struck last year by a book written by Douglas Murray called The Madness of Crowds, which he charts what's happening to our society, how it's happening across race and gender and sexuality, and it's deeply prophetic, this book. It talks about how people are rushing headlong for some idea of justice, but without any source or framework for what that justice might be or what equality might be. Because we want equality, we want justice. But as Tim Keller said in his magisterial address to the National Prayer Breakfast a couple of years ago. We lack the resources for our high ideals. We want these things, but we don't know why we want them. We can't justify it, and we can't describe what they are anymore. But we've still got this, I want justice.
Yeah.
Why do you want justice? And what does justice look like?
Yeah.
You can't have, biblical model of justice is you can't have justice without mercy. They define each other. You can't have freedom without duty or obligation. To be free, you have to have something to be free from. To be dutiful, you have to have the capacity to be free from it. And these are biblical principles that we take for granted and that many people live by today, but they've forgotten the root. And, this is, Os Guinness says, we live in a cut flower culture, a culture where it's like flowers in a vase. They look beautiful, but they're actually divorced from their roots. So they're actually in a process of atrophy, of death. They're wasting away. And we're seeing now the petals are falling off, and the heads are wilting quite considerably at this moment in time.
And people who are honest, I've known Douglas Murray for 20 years, and he came out as an atheist, and he's very friendly with Christopher Hitchens and the like, but that makes his analysis very powerful because he hasn't got an evangelical axe to grind.
He's a gay atheist.
He is.
He's a gay atheist, and he's probably one of the most prophetic voices in the UK at this moment.
Isn't it amazing?
I can't figure that one out, but...
Well, I can, because God used Nebuchadnezzar. I always come back to that as a foghorn, to talk about the sovereignty of God. And so, but it does have a lot of credibility, that book. And he's not the only one, but he can articulate so clearly, can't he?
Yeah, and one of the things, he's looking at all the different sociological changes and the moral changes in society, but also in light of the fact that the media now can recast things so easily. Fake news is a reality, oxymoronically, he says. And I do think that over the next few years, we're going to see the sort of increasing weaponization of info-wars and what's presented before us on our phones, on our TVs, is going to be more and more tailored to our worldview and to help us move from thinking about this issue like this to thinking about this issue like that. And, that's mass hysteria. That's a dangerous situation to be in, especially when you're going into a significant depression.
You've mentioned the madness of crowds. A number of years ago, a book called The Wisdom of Crowds was written, and I wasn't comfortable with it. I was actually talking to some quite senior conservatives, and I'm just a one-trick pony. I talk about Christian morality, and that's what my thing is whenever I'm in any company. And so I'm never going to have a political career. But and I'm getting on now, but it was the time of the regime change discussions in Iraq, and George Bush was going to sort out Iraq, and I pointed out this what happened at Abu Ghraib, which showed the lack of morality in America because they were abusing prisoners. And at that time, everyone was saying, "Oh no, it's a righteous cause," and all of that. And I just remember at that time this book, The Wisdom of Crowds, being on this chap's desk, and it was at the time of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So you ask the crowd, and you're more likely to get the answer. And it's applying a sort of simplistic approach to morality.
The crowd voted Hitler in.
Yes.
We had Vox Dei, and then we had Vox Populi, the voice of God, and then the voice of the people from the French Revolution onwards. Well, the voice of the people is okay if it's infused with the ideas and the references to the morality of God. That's fine. And public debate is, democracy, public debate, bring it on. Yeah. It's great. Yeah. It's what we need more of.
If they allow it. Because it's become so polarised, they don't allow discussion of certain topics.
But the challenge today is, technology being what it is, the voice of the people can be manipulated. Certainly the consciousness of the people can be manipulated in various ways. It can certainly be whipped up. And, a lot a lot of what constitutes modern journalism, as far as I can tell, is a politicized form of managing chaos. You know, instituting and managing chaos. You can't run a society like that. It's not sustainable.
So it's a very bad mix now that we have. You nearly hinted, and I went on to Wisdom of Crowds. It's a very bad moral mix now for us to introduce sort of high-end technological.
Well, no,
powers.
I think we've seen a lot of trends. The John Lennox, I done a talk at a conference that he done a magisterial talk on robotics and AI at the British Library a few years ago. These trends, the technological advances in all these areas, they've been running for many years. They've just accelerated with the pandemic. And we just kind of got to roll with that. And that's going to have an impact on what it means to be human in all sorts of different ways. They're not bad in and of themselves, these trends. It's what we do with them. Who's writing the morality for the algorithms that will be running for AI? I mean, where is the ethical framework going to come from?
That's the problem.
Because if we're just all, as Dawkins says, we're all floating around in a blind, pitiless, indifferent universe, then we're just commodities, one to be used by another. Not according to God, we're not. According to God, we're made in his image and we have intrinsic value, and we are therefore worthy of respect and dignity. Every one of us. And Christians have got to once again start to talk the language of dignity in public life.
Now you've just mentioned commodity. Some time ago, an education secretary basically, and I know you've written on education, basically said, well, the purpose of education is to prepare the children to be part of a modern economy. And it just seems tragic that that's where it's ended up.
The tragedy of education in the UK is it oscillates between that economized, instrumentalized view of life. You're just there as a unit, a productive unit. And then it swings to the left, which is an anti-economistic, but very humanistic, human-centered, child-centered way of doing education, which is just as bad. Then it swings the other way. Then it swings this way. When education is essentially formation. And neither of them two extremes really understand that education is about formation into what God has called us to be. And we're all different, and it needs to be tailored to us in many ways, but we all require an understanding of who we are, where we are, why we have value, and our role in God's creation.
I was preaching in Holland a couple of years ago and came onto that verse in Proverbs that says, teach a child in the way he should go, and he will not depart from it. And he translated it, but afterwards he came up to me and said, if you read that verse in the original, it says, teach a child in the way and they will not depart from it. In other words, the way that a child is indoctrinated, whether it's good or bad, will influence.
Well, now we come on to the myth of secular neutrality, which is something that we deal with constantly in the policy work and the advocacy work generally. This idea that religious people, all our views are freighted with these different opinions and biases, but the secular view, that's somehow morally neutral and lives in this suspended animation of ethics.
It gives everyone a fair shout.
Yeah, which is absolute nonsense. It takes about 1 second to figure out that secularism is a many-splintered thing, and it's not one thing. But within all of that, it always favours some views and disfavours others, and favours some groups and disfavours others. There's no such thing as secular neutrality. And Christians have got to just keep hammering away at that deception. It's a myth.
But very difficult in a secular school environment now to pop your head up and as a parent or as a child to say, no,
indeed,
that doesn't
it is, but there are lots of resources out there for helping people with apologetics and how to propose the value of a biblical worldview. and people's hearts are softened. The shaking has softened hearts in all sorts of different ways. So there are opportunities for this.
And you produced at the EA, Evangelical Alliance, a booklet to help parents and others in education. And they can get it online.
Yeah, they can get that. It's called You're Not Alone, and it's just about, it's general information about the rights of parents in education, but also the responsibilities of getting involved and interested in school life. And I would say as well, Tim, it suggests an even bigger and more important theme, which is the responsibilities of churches to support Christian parents at this time. You know, for Christian parents with children going through the state system, in terms of what we've just inherited, I mean, it may be different in 10 years' time, God willing it will be, but they need all the support they can get, not just prayer support, but practical support from churches. And I would urge all church leaders to get alongside Christian parents at this time.
It's interesting you said responsibilities, because there's a sort of a trend to now pit rights of parents against the rights of a child. So the right of a child to have a neutral education, you know, should trump the rights of, you know, parents to educate according to their philosophy.
Well, I mean, education, state-maintained schools are maintained by the state for the parents who pay the taxes for the schools. Schools exist for parents. You know, children's rights are important. I work, I'm on the board of 2 large persecuted church organisations. And, you know, the rights of children across the world who are suffering terribly at this moment in time are really, really important, particularly in refugee contexts. But I am concerned that in the West, the next great frontier for liberal progressivism, for secular elites, does look like it's going to be age as a kind of social construction. And this is the idea of the state investing children with rights in the home against the parents, which is completely unheard, except in certain Soviet systems, but that's completely unheard of in our culture. And importantly, and this is where this goes, rights over their own bodies. And I am concerned about that. And, you know, when you look at developments at the moment in the Californian legislature around paedophilia and things like that, I just think this, if it's unchecked, the children's rights discourse will inevitably go in that direction.
Because that's the logic, and there is
the logic.
It's like step by step by step. It's not going to stop.
And children's rights, it's worth saying, you know, much of the children's rights that we have today were pioneered by people like Shaftesbury and the Booths, William and Catherine Booth of the Salvation Army. They understood that God has called us to protect children from us, from people. And many of the laws we have today that do protect children come from an evangelical source.
And we hope with the Department for Education changing their guidelines on what is taught to young children, we hope that may be a turning point.
I mean, that is just common sense and long overdue and very welcome. And let's hope that we, in the decade ahead, our education system and the ethos of our education system, more importantly, is more open and truthful.
Yeah. So I'm as I say, I'm sort of unapologetic radical. So I feel that the root issue of all that we've been discussing in education in society, and we hinted at it in Romans 1, is that there's no acknowledgement now in secular schools at all of any area of God in science. And I find that a serious issue because the design is there, but they can't acknowledge God. The inexplicability of certain things, but they can't acknowledge him. And I feel by taking that completely out of a child's worldview is the root of the issue. We've got 5 minutes, so I thought I'd throw that one in.
Well, I mean, there have been many, many theories of evolution. The current zeitgeist is this, it was that. And why not teach other theories of where we're from and what we're about? And if religion, as we know it will, is going to be far more prevalent in the future than secularism, and we know this for a fact, globally, I mean, there's a paradox with secularism. It's really ascendant and very powerful and influential, but at the same time, bankrupt, vulnerable, and diminishing across the globe in proportion to the growth of religion. And that's set to...
Interjecting, we interviewed a number of years ago Anjem Chowdhury, of all people. I got into a lot of hot water over that. But he was so cocksure that our whole system is weak, and in the long run, Islam and Islamism is going to prevail in Europe.
Well, Islamism is prevailing in some parts of Europe. I mean, that's a truth, if prevailing's the right word. But the point is this: the future, and Christianity is very much leading the numerical growth of all of this. The future is less secular globally than it is now, and that's a given. And the problem we have, Tim, is our little bubble of our culture in the West. We're thinking with an old paradigm. And when we engage with politicians and we talk with politicians, particularly when we're talking about persecuted church issues, you can't understand the world that we're in right now without having an understanding of religion and the role it plays in people's lives in giving value, meaning, and ordering relationships, and being a benefit to civil society. And I'm talking about all religions here. You know, we're wired for faith, and that's not a bad thing. The atheist delusion, we've been in a very unusual band of history. So my parents, not Christian. Their parents were Christian. Their children are Christian. But they were in this strange little band where they didn't think God was necessary and they thought smoking was good for you, kind of thing. So, I do think that we're seeing a kind of a shift globally, certainly, and it will play out in our own Western culture in different ways.
I've got a book on my shelf by Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State before she was...
Mighty and the Almighty.
Classic, isn't it? And she was involved in the whole Oslo peace process where they hadn't actually put in the religious dimension.
But she had the courage to acknowledge that she realised that she could not understand the way the world was operating and therefore make the decisions that needed to be made without understanding religion. So, you know, our governments have talked about developing religious literacy and knowledge with civil servants and everything else for many, many years. I think now is the time to press that home and just say, come on, get serious about it. You need to understand why people are motivated to do what they do, because we live in another paradox. The church is doing loads of amazing stuff in the middle of this pandemic, and our MPs are registering it. They've communicated it to us. They love what the church is doing. But here's the thing. We are valued and vilified. We are needed. We're needed, but we're not really wanted. People like what we do, but they don't really like why we do it. And you can't separate those things. Look at the work by CAP, Christians Against Poverty, debt relief, biggest debt relief charity in the UK. Amazing, but they're unashamedly Christian. And God blesses them.
Bless them, and God bless you, David. It's been, we've ranged through a lot of things in this time, and we've kept going. Oh, you have drunk some of your water. So let's just not be ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. Thank you for watching.